Welcome back. So, last time we were flying the helicopter around the theme park level, and I didn't, due to a computation error, I didn't exactly get the point across, but I hope that you gathered that I didn't do as well as I might have. Followed it up right at the end there, so we're going to do it again, and this time we're going to do it right. I'm actually grateful for the opportunity to go back to the adventure park here because there is a similarity between car fighting games, car combat games, and other games that use a similar trope, and I'm going to point out that trope as soon as we spot it here. Here, on the left, a roller coaster. And this whole map has a big old roller coaster that runs all the way through it. Now, I bring out the roller coaster because it calls to mind well, obviously, it's a very handy game mechanic. You have... and kaboom! It's a very handy game mechanic because it's a way to create a path that goes from one spot to another in a way that is not orthogonal, does not conform to a grid, and you would not find in a place like a city or a town or a highway. It's an excuse to make the kind of level you wish you could make, and not necessarily the kind of level you might find in real life. And what this reminds me of is the old RPG trope of the Colosseum. Maybe in medieval fantasy RPGs or stuff like that, you've seen the Colosseum level where your character gets dumped into a Colosseum or something, or some kind of arena, and is forced to fight people and fight against a mix of enemies that your character would not ordinarily encounter. Now, in some games, the idea of your character fighting in an arena can get pretty hackneyed. Here's the hero of the land who's supposed to save the world from the Dark Lord, and he's wasting time fighting gladiator games. What is he doing? And just as those games like to employ Colosseums, car combat games like to have roller coasters. Velocity X has one, and Twisted Metal has one, and those are the only two car combat games I've ever played, so that's a 2 out of 2 already. Even if there's no other car combat game in the world that has them, I think you'll still agree that's a surprising proportion. And the reason is, just as the Colosseum lets you, the game designer, put combinations of enemies together that wouldn't ordinarily be together, like, what's this, a swamp fox and an arctic bat together in one, and I'm fighting them both together? How did this happen? Arenas provide the excuse for that, and the same way, roller coasters provide an excuse to do bits of level design that game designers would want to use, but wouldn't have the excuse to otherwise. And, some people will complain, this doesn't make any sense, this is such a cliche, and so on, and they're not entirely wrong to do that, but it's important to realize that this is done in the service of level design. Now, in a perfect world, there would be no conflict in between level design and good gameplay, but it takes a lot of inventiveness to come up with levels that just that make perfect sense and are good for gameplay. And to come up with an entire game's worth of levels that are like that is almost impossible. So that's why we get compromises like levels that only sometimes make sense in the game context, but provide the game developers with the excuse to do what they want to do. And I like it when they do that. Especially in sillier games like this one, which is, there's a lot of absurdity in this game's blood. So having a roller coaster doesn't break things very much. In a more realistic game like, I don't know, Call of Duty, then this would be a little stranger, but we don't have that we don't have that limitation. That's partly why realistic graphics are very much a mixed blessing for a level designer, because realistic graphics bring in the oops I did not mean to run over that person. They bring in the expectation that the game's physics also be realistic. Now, Twisted Metal more or less thumbs its nose at this, but generally, generally we expect games to be as realistic as their graphics are. And so a game like Mario Kart doesn't catch any flack because its physics aren't realistic, because of course they're not. Just look at it. And that's why I'm glad to see that even as graphics get more able to be realistic, video games do not necessarily spend all their effort trying to look realistic. You get games like, well, my favorite example is De Blob for the Wii, that are okay just looking the way they look, whether it's realistic or not, and it helps adjust players' expectations for unrealistic physics engines. Whoops. Ha! Landmine. I think I hit myself with that too. The reason I'm laughing is because whenever your car gets thrown unexpectedly, like by that magnet that I got stuck by and then thrown by, is because in this game, when your car does that, you can hear your crew yelping inside the cabin. And that is a realistic touch that to most developers it would not occur to them to add. You know, this game's supposed to be cool. Why would we have the player character screaming in fear? Well, the reason is because it makes sense. And it humanizes the crew in a way that is unexpectedly charming. And also helps establish that these weapons are powerful. If your crew fears getting thrown 1,000 feet by a blast, well, you're more likely to respond properly to it as well. Just a simple sympathetic response. It's sort of like how, in a movie, if there's an action sequence and the heroes are enjoying the action, you're more likely to enjoy the action. It's not very realistic for someone to have fun in the middle of a gunfight, but if you're supposed to have fun watching it, they will have the actors look like they're having fun having the fight. It's just the way presentation works. I don't like this guy. Ha! Have a landmine. Okay, time to go, because the reason I died last time was because I spent too much time outside the force cage, and in this case I have a vehicle almost as fragile as the one I had last time, which blew up. There it is, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. Yeah, we're good. Ow. No, 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 no. Darn it. I may be taking damage, but I healed damage, so it's worth it. Whoops, which way's the cage? It's that way. Phew. Okay, okay. Now I'm back to the situation I was in. I'm fighting the Sweet Tooth truck again. Not piloted by Sweet Tooth, because as we've established, this game doesn't respect that. But this time, I'm not going to foul it up. Yes! Another bit of cartoon physics this game rather unexpectedly gets away with is that this vehicle I'm driving here, its special weapon is not technically part of the vehicle. I mean, it comes with the vehicle, but physically it's not a gun that folds out of your hood or anything. what happens is your gunner leans out of the passenger side window, holds out a chain gun, and starts firing it. Now, I've never done that. Well, okay, there was that one time, but it would be pretty rough on your hips, wouldn't it? On your back? You're not meant to... A spinal column is not meant to support weight, not meant to support shear force, which is what it's doing there. And here that guy is leaning out of the car, holding up the gun and aiming it, while the driver is doing all sorts of crazy stuff like I'm doing, and power sliding and jumping and falling, and, surprisingly enough, I'm okay with it in this game. It doesn't seem dissonant, but ordinarily I'd say a game would need cartoony graphics to get away with that. Now, all the stuff in this room is stuff from previous Twisted Metal games, stuff that Calypso gave to competitors as rewards or as some kind of inducement to play in his game in the first place, or mementos that his contestants had and lost after they died, because of course they died. And the funny thing is, not all of those contestants can have won. These games, they're not all part of the same continuity. They disagree with each other. They portray Calypso differently. They portray the characters differently. They portray the world differently. I think it really strains... It seems very unlikely that they're all part of the same reality. So that's another hint that this is not quite real. Or maybe other games weren't real and this one is. Or somehow that reality is just not reliable. Also, one of those artifacts was not from Twisted Metal. It was one of the swords that Kratos from God of War uses. Now, I'm sure he would compete in Twisted Metal if he could, but he can't because he's from a different game. That is... I've heard of Easter eggs, but that was right up there on that shelf, as prominent as any of the other artifacts. So, maybe the best thing to take from that is that I'm taking this too seriously. Now, the reason I talked over that cutscene with talk about nothing but the artifacts is that had not a darn thing to do with our main character, Mr. Grimm. He didn't show up at all. Other games... Okay, one other game, Twisted Metal Black, has done this. Sometimes there's a character who does not seem to have the full set of cutscenes. I guess the writers just felt it didn't justify it. And here we're introducing a different character, the Preacher, who is not playable in the campaign. He doesn't have his own campaign, but he is playable in challenge mode. There are 4 factions. There's Mr. Grimm's faction, I forget what it's called. There's the Clowns, there's the Dolls, and there's the Holy Men, who work for the Preacher. Now, what that tells me is that maybe, earlier on, the game makers' plans to have a 4th campaign, maybe with the Preacher, and have him more fleshed out, and maybe things had to get contracted, because budgets never last as long as we always hope they do. I don't have proof of that or anything. Nobody has said that in an interview, to my knowledge. But it seems it would fit perfectly with what we see here. What the game creators have said in interviews bears recounting here. There was an interview on YouTube, and I'm pretty sure it was during the production of the new Twisted Metal game, but talking about the production of Twisted Metal Black, which I've mentioned that game the most because it seems to draw a lot of... it seems to have inspired this game the most directly. And the creative director for those games, including this one, is David Jaffe. And what he says in interviews is that he really around the time they were making Black, in the early 2000s, he just fell in love with the world that he and his buddies were making on this in these games, and his wording implied that he put more effort than he had expected to put into creating the stories, creating the cutscenes, and creating the characters, as opposed to the gameplay. In that interview, The Dark Past, I think it's called, if I read him right, he even seemed to express a little bit of regret that he didn't pay a little more attention to gameplay balancing. I cannot attest to whether or not his regret is real or well-founded, because I have not played that game. But nonetheless, the point is that the creator really loved this world he was writing, which is, well, that's always a sign you're going to get some very inspired material. And one other thing he said that really struck me was he talked about some of his co-writers who talked about what kind of message these stories had. Not in a moralistic, think of the children sort of way, but in a, we're writing and we need to keep in mind what this story is meant to say. And as he later recounted it, his reaction to the idea that his stories had a message, their stories had a message, was, get the heck out of this kitchen, I'm trying to make this gosh darn stew. Now, I think you can guess he did not use those exact words, but the point is, he didn't like that idea. And that made me think, because, when you have stories that are inspired, that the storyteller really wanted to tell, maybe they're not made as polemics with specific messages in mind, but they always convey at least something. Otherwise, why did the writer want to make them in the first place? And, with that in mind, I've looked at the Twisted Metal cutscenes. In fact, I've spent a lot of time looking at them. And what they come across like to me is as comeuppance stories. Evil characters do evil things either to try and get out of evil free or to gain redemption the quick and easy way. And it blows up in their faces. And that's not really a spoiler. The Twisted Metal games, that's just how they're done. Things end badly for these evil characters. Now, yeah, we'll come back to this when we see a few more of the endings in this game, but all the crazy stuff in this game, all the, all the destruction, all of the is this real, all the bad endings, I don't believe that it all amounts to nothing. What's this? What's this? Aha! It's my favorite weapon, these super machine guns. Every car has these quick-firing, non-homing machine guns that you can fire at your opponents, and they have infinite ammo. And one of my favorite pickups is, and it's very low damage, these machine guns are a crummy option that you would only go to in an emergency. Well, one of my favorite pickups is the item that makes your machine guns actually good, genuinely very powerful, very scary weapon. Partly because I like the way aiming feels. Haha! And partly because those guns are so visually prominent on your car, that sticking out there, it feels like you should be able to put them to effective use. So actually being able to do that when you pick up the item is very satisfying. This way, the visuals of this game, it's weird, they inform my style. They convince me of what weapons I should be using more often. Yeah, wham! Oof. Okay, that's a tactic I had not used very often before. Freeze missile plus ram, that's a good time. For those of you wondering why I just skidded to the side there, it's not because my truck suddenly took ill with Saturday night fever, that happens sometimes, but because that car, road boat, was using his magnet to try to suck me through the support. See, he's doing it again. Darn it! Didn't no one tell him that's rude? Oof. And now I'm in a good spot here because my opponents are coming one at a time. They don't group up and use tactics the way humans would if it was a bunch of people against one. Now we're a little more out in the open, so I've lost a bit of my old advantage. But I still think I've got this guy. Or this gal. I have to get used to all these... Oof. All these opponents being females. Eric. Looks like Meatwagon's back underground. And I have another freeze missile. A course of action suggests itself! Haha! Haha! Gotcha. Now, you probably haven't been able to see because it's not very clear on my screen, but all of these doll face goons, all the doll themed fighters here, they all have doll masks. And we'll see that Dollface has a similar outfit. And what strikes me is the similarity, the continuity between Sweet Tooth's outfit, he's a creepy clown, and the creepy dolls here. It's, fun, childish stuff, made, twisted and violent and evil. And, if my math is right, we're at about 22 minutes, and what's next up is another stage, and unless it happens to be a race... It is a race. Okay, we can do this and not go over 30 minutes. So I'll tell you about it. On one side we have, clowns, which are supposed to be fun entertainers for children, turned into murderous maniacs, and we have dolls, which are supposed to be, sweet, innocent companions for children, turned into murderous maniacs. And they both involve masks. You can tell that this is a motif that the game developers really liked. And it's also worth noting the visual design they have. And as you can see, in both cases, the eyeballs are obscured. Dollface, whom we'll see in cutscenes later, her eyes are completely black. You can't see the whites and the irises and just the biological eyeballs behind them. I don't actually know how they achieved that, because the real mask would show her eyes very clearly. And Sweet Tooth, of course, has a mask that obscures one of his eyes. And like I said earlier, asymmetrical and obscuring one eye makes a character look, untrustworthy or wrong or just somehow messed up. Meow. And it really points to the very abridged humanity of these characters. They're not ordinary or proper humans. There's no doubt about that. And Mr. Grimm, here's Mr. Grimm, who's none of those things. His design, is a skull. It's a symbol of death. So, and ever since medieval Catholicism decided that the human body and human physicality was gross and ungodly, there's been a disgust in Western culture with all things physical, and that goes double for stuff that has to do with death, like skulls. You don't see skulls from healthy people. So Mr. Grimm wears a skull on his face, but you can still see his eyeballs just fine. You can see his hair, his mouth, his face is perfectly intact. So his design actually makes him look a lot more sympathetic than the other Twisted Metal characters, which is pretty much the lowest bar ever, but still, it's true. Oh crud, where do I go? Darn it. Ah! Darn it, that makes the kids laugh. I'll admit I have not tried it while playing Twisted Metal. Making children laugh while playing Twisted Metal, that's I've never done it, and it's not even on my bucket list. I gotta say, probably never gonna get around to that. Ah! Whoops! This game will be generous if you miss 1 or 2 gates out of all the checkpoints you're supposed to hit. It makes me wonder what exploits there might be about gates that are hard to hit, that you just miss and therefore just rely on the game's generosity to spot you through. I have not played this game or these races enough to know that. Yoo! Bell tower, bell tower, bell tower! What place am I in? A lot of the challenge, it occurs to me that the races in this game are challenging, and a lot of it is not because of the physics engine, which, as we've been over, it's not a racing physics engine, it's a fighting physics engine, and they've adapted it to racing. Well, a lot of the reason these races are challenging is because of navigation. They string up these big prominent billboards in front of you. But nonetheless, it's very easy to get lost or turned around, and you have to keep your eyes far ahead. And the visuals of this game are very busy, but they're also very monochrome. So those big green lights, green and red lights, and those big yellow arrows stick out very strongly against the environment. So it's not like you're straining your eyes, like you're trying to see camouflage. But it is like you're using up a lot of your, as my father would say, a lot of your mental bandwidth. Darn it! To tell where the course is. And that makes, it would get old eventually, but that makes for a fun challenge. And speaking of fun challenges, the game does not warn you it's going to do this. But yeah, see, deathmatch surprise. You're supposed to, now that you've made it, the top 4 finishers are supposed to kill each other. And that's, I like that the game makes you adapt. That wasn't a surprise for me because I've played this game before. But the first time it was, the first time I had played this game, it did come straight out of nowhere. It forced me to learn how to fight in this racing car that I don't usually fight in. And it also fed into the characterization of Calypso, who is pretty much the face of the game, so he's a very important character. And they use the mechanics to establish that. I know I've gone on and on about personality. Well, get ready for some more, because game mechanics feed into that, and especially specific game events. In the Dark Souls series, the game Dark Souls, there's a rather famous, infamous moment where you're making your way through a dungeon, like you do in these games, and you go up a staircase, seemingly perfectly on the up and up, and suddenly a big rolling Indiana Jones style ball comes in out of nowhere, comes down the stairs and squashes you flat. And oops. Where's that guy? There it is. And it's a very memorable moment that establishes the game's world as harsh, unforgiving, full of death, and just unreasonable. It's a can't-win kind of world. I couldn't even see that boulder, and it came down and squashed me. At the same time, if you're really good, you can dodge that on the first time. I didn't, but I'm sure some people did. And in the same way, here's a game that will send you through a bomb race, and you'll think you know what you're in for, and then suddenly the race ends, and out comes the deathmatch. Get out your guns, get going. And that's a very Twisted Metal thing. In Mario Kart, which is, of course, very happy-go-lucky and whimsical, you could be forgiven for resenting the game for springing that kind of surprise on you, but here, it fits just fine. Now, next episode, we're going to do something that doesn't fit just fine. I look forward to talking about that, and we'll get to that next episode. I'll see you then.